Anya's white Volvo rumbled down the motorway as Fred drove them out of London. She sat in the passenger seat, leaning back, her posture slightly drawn in on itself, while behind them, their daughter was lost in her own small world, strapped in and absorbed by the quiet glow of her tablet screen. Fred's gaze shifted between the road and Anya's face, catching the faint traces of exhaustion that she tried to hide beneath a thin layer of makeup, a gentle veil of color, softening the shadows of a hard night. He took her hand, interlaced his fingers with hers, and gave a small, steady squeeze. When she turned toward him, he saw both warmth and fragility in her eyes, as if those two opposing forces were bound within a single soul. A soft, fleeting smile touched her lips, brief but strong enough to carve itself into his memory, and the way she gripped his hand carried the quiet desperation of someone holding on to an anchor. Fred lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, then glanced at the rearview mirror, searching for reassurance in the sight of their daughter, blissfully unaware of her parents' silent unrest, lost to everything beyond her little world. He wanted to laugh, because he felt like a man caught in an act of forbidden tenderness, but he knew this wasn't a moment for laughter. "It took us a whole hour just to get out of the city," he said at last. "We should reach Canvey Island in about half an hour." At the mention of that place, Anya sank deeper into her seat, her breathing calm but taut. Fred, still holding her hand, spoke with a gentleness strong enough to quiet a storm. "Hey, just so you know, we can turn around any time you want." But when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't that of someone considering escape, but the voice of someone haunted by her past. "My nerves are already chaotic just thinking about seeing them again, and knowing they still don't know about Kai. Maybe they found out somehow, maybe they looked into it, but I doubt they ever lifted a finger to find the so-called lost member of the family. They didn't even bother to tell me my father had died." Her words fell like stones into water, small but heavy, sending widening circles of pain rippling outward. "What do you think will happen?" Fred asked quietly, his grip on her hand tightening, as if he could shield her from all the imagined outcomes through the strength of his touch. Anya shrugged, then drew a breath, the kind of breath one takes when trying to survive their own thoughts. "I have no idea, Fred. I just hope Ezra told them I'm coming. I honestly don't know what to expect." The pressure of her hand was so intense, he could almost feel her heartbeat through her fingers, but he didn't pull away. He let her pour the weight of it into that connection, as though he knew it was the only way she could steady herself. When she turned to him, her eyes were wide, restless, and in them flickered a plea more important than anything else. "Fred, can you do everything you can to make sure Kai doesn't feel the tension of all this?" He smiled softly. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep our daughter untouched by it, I promise." That simple answer brought a fragile smile to her lips, and once again, he pressed a kiss to her hand, just as their daughter, wide-eyed and curious, watched them in silence, the scene speaking louder than either parent could. Fred looked at the navigation display and said, almost as if trying to steer the moment back toward safety, "We should be there in about 10 minutes. I've never been to this place before." Anya's voice, tinged with nostalgia and sorrow, carried the burden of memory. "It's full of greenery, little lakes, small enough to fit into someone's garden, and there's a beach too. Everything's close by, so green and so nostalgic." When he asked if she missed it, she hesitated for a moment, wrestling with herself before confessing quietly, "I do. If I hadn't been such a fool, I wouldn't be in London now, rejected, unloved and alone." "You're not alone," he said, slowing as the traffic light ahead turned red. "I'm right here. You have me, okay?" His words, simple and calm, carried more strength than any promise. When she looked at him and smiled, he knew that nothing in the world could ever match the worth of that small, quiet moment. And in that instant, without needing to say it aloud, Fred made a vow to protect her, to keep watch over James, the man whose name was a wound and a bitterness in his mind, the man he held responsible for everything Anya had endured and who had never paid the price. When they finally reached the end of the narrow road and saw the estate, Fred felt his muscles tighten. The gate stood wide open, the yard stretched out like a park, and in front of the mansion lined a row of black cars whose solemn presence alone seemed almost threatening. He parked the Volvo where Anya pointed, between two sleek Range Rovers, while she sat still, gazing through the window, lost in thoughts and memories. He stepped out, opened the back door, and helped Kai free herself from the seatbelt, straightening her hair as her small hand, full of trust, slipped into his. At last, Anya stepped out too, setting foot on the soil of her childhood, ground she hadn't touched in 8 years. Her gaze wandered across the property, searching for changes, but everything was the same. The same pathways, the same open yard, the same quiet, carrying echoes of the past. The only thing different was the garden, lush, blooming, shaped into rich circular hedges, fragrant and alive, a stark contrast to her trembling heart. Footsteps echoed from behind the house, and Anya instinctively tensed as 3 men appeared, 2 young ones, barely grown, and an older man walking ahead. When he opened his arms, she ran to him and wrapped him in an embrace stronger than any words. "Ezra," she whispered. He drew her close, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "Welcome home, Miss Woodburg." "I don't even know what to say." She pulled back slightly, but still held his hands, her eyes searching the familiar lines of his face. "Ezra," she repeated softly. He clasped her fingers and said, with an honesty that cut through the silence, "My condolences." "Thank you," she managed, fighting the swell of emotion rising within her. Her wide, gentle eyes didn't stop taking him in. He smiled and gestured to the young men beside him. "These are my sons, Jack and John." Anya nodded, slightly surprised. "I didn't know you had children." The boys greeted her politely, and Fred stepped closer, his arm resting around Kai, who clung to him, staring at Ezra with wide, curious eyes. "This is Fred," Anya said, "and our daughter, Kai." A spark of surprise and gentle admiration lit Ezra's expression. "She's beautiful, Anya." Anya nodded with quiet gratitude, and Ezra turned to his sons. "Boys, help them with their bags." "Oh, no," Anya hurried to say, as though even the thought of help might expose her unease. "We only have a small bag, nothing more." But the sound of high heels clicking from the side cut her off, sharp, rhythmic, merciless, like the beat of a heart skipping in her chest. For a moment, she thought she might run back to the car, away from it all, but then Fred placed his hand over hers. The gesture was silent, barely noticeable, yet enough to steady her pulse and remind her she wasn't alone. From around the corner emerged a figure carrying the weight of years, memories, and time itself, a woman whose presence brought both pain and comfort, a living thread of the past suddenly woven back into the present. It was her mother, Delara Woodburg. She walked faster than her age allowed, but stopped abruptly when the scene before her came into view. The daughter she hadn't seen in so many years, standing beside an unfamiliar, broad-shouldered man who held a little girl in his arms as though she were the most precious thing in the world. Ezra and his sons, as if they instinctively understood that this moment belonged to no one but the 4 of them, quietly withdrew, disappearing into the background and leaving the space to those to whom it truly belonged. Delara still carried the grace of a woman marked by quiet aristocracy, dignity stitched into every movement and every line of her face. Though the fine creases around her eyes and mouth spoke of years that hadn't been kind, she retained the unmistakable air of elegance and pride, as if she bore the invisible blood of ancestors in her veins. Looking at her, Anya could trace her own features and those of her sister in her mother's face, a living reflection of their shared past, untouched even by years of silence. They stood facing one another, silent and upright, almost like mirrors, separated only by the subtle shades that time had brushed into her mother's complexion. The once tightly curled hair Anya remembered from childhood now fell in soft waves over her shoulders, a quiet testament to both change and continuity, an image where the old and the new intertwined. Her mother took a step forward, as if afraid the vision might vanish if she so much as blinked. Her gaze darted restlessly between Anya and Kai, then to the man holding the child, searching for meaning in the tableau before her, trying to find the moment when everything would make sense. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall, fighting them back as her hands hung still at her sides. Anya, uncertain of the right gesture, lifted her hand as though to offer a handshake, seeking formality where she feared raw emotion might undo her. But Delara only shook her head, breaking the distance between them in an instant, and pulled her daughter into an embrace stronger and truer than any spoken word. Anya closed her eyes and surrendered to it, and for a moment, time stopped. She was a child again, seeking safety in her mother's arms, shielded from the world, wrapped in warmth that asked for no explanations. All the years of absence, every painful silence, every fracture between them, all of it tightened into the knot in her stomach, a knot that had grown over the years and now unraveled in trembling and tears she could no longer contain. She held on just as tightly, almost desperately, as though trying through that single embrace to mend everything that had been broken, afraid that if she let go, she would lose her again. "Anya,
Did it really have to come to this for us to meet again? Murmured Dilara, her voice trembling, only a shadow of its usual composure. I don't know, Mother. I don't know. It seems this was the only way, Anya answered softly, her voice fragile, the words scraping her throat as if they might choke her. Her mother drew her closer still, her gaze flickering toward Fred's face and then to the little girl in his arms.
Eyes that reminded her of what she once had and what she should never have lost. But the fragile piece of that reunion was broken by the sound of new footsteps. Anya's body tensed, drawn taut like a string pulled too tight, her gaze locked on the figure approaching in silence. It was Elizabeth, her sister. She walked slowly, but every movement radiated distance and restraint, as if the very rhythm of her steps drew invisible lines that must not be crossed. There were no tears in her eyes, no softness, only sharpness and resolve, a shield that would not yield. She stopped, gave a curt nod, and extended her hand in greeting. When she spoke, her voice was cool and brittle, like ice cracking under pressure. I'm glad you managed to come. Fred had to swallow back a bitter laugh. There was nothing in her tone or expression that resembled insincerity. The sisters shook hands, briefly, formally, and in the next heartbeat, Elizabeth withdrew her hand, as if even that touch had burned her. Anya had replayed this moment countless times in her mind, imagined it in quiet moments, dreamt of her return, but reality was crueler. There was no embrace, no quiet "I've missed you," not even the shadow of a welcoming smile. Instead, in Elizabeth's eyes, she found the same cold judgment, the same old resentment, the same rejection that had once driven her away. Elizabeth's gaze fell on Kai, dressed in her little football jersey and shorts, and in that glance, Anya caught something her sister failed to hide: disdain. Subtle, but sharp enough to wound. Fred felt his jaw tighten, his stare darkening with anger. No one had the right to look at their child that way, with silent contempt that spread like poison. And then, from the far edge of the courtyard, near the side entrance, Anya's eyes caught a figure she could never fail to recognize, no matter how much she wished she could. He stood there, leaning against the cold stone railing, his eyes fixed on her, unrelenting, filled with everything he hadn't the courage to say. James, the one she could neither forget nor forgive. And time stopped once more. Their eyes met, and in that collision, the past spoke louder than the present. He took a few hesitant steps down the stairs and stopped midway, torn between desire and fear. His gaze moved from Fred to Anya, and finally to the little girl, and in that instant, a thought struck him so violently it stole his breath. Could it be? Was that their child? Fred's anger was silent but palpable, like a storm crouched just beyond the horizon. He stared straight into James's eyes, a look heavy with everything that man had ever done to Anya, all the betrayals, all the pain, and all the wounds that had never truly healed. The urge to strike him and to break him was sharp and consuming. But instead, Fred turned to the only truth that anchored him to himself. He lifted Kai higher into his arms and held her close, as if that single gesture could draw a line through the chaos of their intertwined lives. The girl wrapped her arms around his neck, resting her cheek on his shoulder, perfectly at peace, as though she had always belonged there. James watched her with the kind of pain that makes the body stiffen. The more he looked at her face, the delicate features that confused him, the less he could deny what was clear. She had Fred's jaw, his posture, his steadiness. But those eyes, deep and blue, and undeniably Anya's, spoke a truth no words could disguise. His chest tightened, and it was Dilara's voice, soft yet unrelenting, that finally tore him out of that spiral. Anya, my dear, who is this? She asked gently, stepping closer to Fred and running her hand over the child's arm. Kai gave her a shy smile, uncertain, but pure and kind. This is Fred, and the little girl is your granddaughter, Mama. Our daughter. Her name is Kai. Dilara's eyes flickered like a flame, suddenly fed with air. Beneath the years of sorrow and exhaustion, something glowed, a spark of wonder, fragile but alive. My granddaughter, she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Oh, Anya, I had no idea. I didn't know. Anya said nothing. Her throat was too tight, her thoughts scattered. All she could do was watch her daughter, clinging to Fred's shoulder, her tiny hands tangled with his, proof of a bond stronger than any wound or distance. James remained frozen, caught in a battle within himself. He no longer belonged to this circle of life. He was a shadow of their past, not a figure of their present. The realization cut deep. He knew he couldn't stand there forever, halfway between what was and what would never be again. With a heavy breath, the scars of his past seemed to resurface, etched freshly across his face. Please, come inside, Dilara said at last, extending her hand to Fred.
He accepted it warmly, though he never let go of Kai, and the girl showed no sign of wanting to be put down. Dilara then nodded toward Ezra in the distance as a quiet gesture of recognition and gratitude. She knew that without him, Anya would not have stood there now. She would not have seen her daughter, nor discovered the grandchild she dreamed of. Anya led the way, Fred following close behind, holding Kai with the calm dignity of a man who knew exactly what mattered. As they approached the steps, she passed James. He lifted his hand in greeting, weak and uncertain. She responded out of courtesy, their fingers barely brushing, fleeting and cold, like strangers passing in the street. Fred didn't even glance his way. He walked past him in silence, as if the man no longer existed. Dilara followed them inside, with Ezra and his sons trailing behind, while Elizabeth and James remained outside, alone. Elizabeth was far from calm. Fury stirred in her like a storm beneath the surface, visible only in the flash of her eyes. She stood tall, composed in her pride, but when James reached toward her, hand raised as if to speak, she simply stepped aside, turned her face away, and walked on proudly and untouchable, leaving him standing there. James lingered at the threshold alone, his hand falling helplessly to his side as his thoughts coiled around him like snakes. He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to push away the fog, but it only thickened. And then, finally, he too crossed the threshold. With him, the past entered as well, uninvited and unresolved, bringing with it everything that had once been: love, passion, betrayal, and pain. The house breathed it all in again.
"He worked well with your sister that evening," Dilara began softly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room, where even breathing seemed too loud. Kai sat curled between her parents, her small body pressed against Fred's side, her wide eyes darting from one adult face to another, sensing, without understanding, that something weighty and painful was unfolding before her. Dilara spoke slowly, as if measuring every word, shaping the story with delicate care. After they finished their work, from what I gathered, Elizabeth left his office, and he stayed behind. He poured himself a drink. Her gaze followed Anya's, fixed on the portrait of Ryan Woodberg above the fireplace, framed in dark, aged wood, the image of a man who no longer existed, and yet, somehow, was still woven into the foundation of every room in this house, every crack in the walls and every sigh of those who had loved him. You know where he went afterward, don't you? To the lake. You know how much he loved that place. Anya slowly lowered her head, a loose strand of hair slipping over her cheek as she nervously tucked it behind her ear. Her heart trembled in her chest. In her mind, she built the picture her mother spoke of: wooden docks slick with mist, the damp scent of lake water, the echo of footsteps belonging to a man who thought he was heading home, when in truth, he was leaving forever. He slipped on the stairs leading down to the dock and hit his head when he fell. Her mother's voice was soft, fragile even, as if she herself carried the weight of that fall, as if each word dropped into the silence like a stone sinking into water. Anya stared ahead, seeing nothing, and yet she could almost picture it, the sharp blow, the cold surface, and the helplessness that followed. But he knew that place like the back of his hand, she whispered, her voice barely audible, the tone of a child still hoping someone might return. The police said the impact was severe. He lost consciousness before he hit the water. The doctor found traces of water in his lungs. He drowned. The words broke her breath. Anya buried her face in her palms and murmured, almost soundlessly, "I don't understand. I can't comprehend how this could happen to him." Dilara reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, her fingertips lingering against her cheek, offering little warmth she could. Their eyes met. Her mother's eyes were the very same ones Anya had summoned in dreams during nights when she believed she would never see them again. She fell into her mother's embrace, trembling, struggling to hold back tears, but the fragile barrier of her composure had already given way. Her sobs broke free, raw and shaking. Her mother's arms were firm yet soft, the kind of refuge one always returns to, no matter how far they've wandered. The silence was suddenly shattered by the burst of laughter from two little girls who ran through the open front door, bringing with them the scent of spring wind and the innocence of a world still untouched by loss. One was older, the other smaller. Both had chestnut hair and wide, curious brown eyes. They ran straight to James and Elizabeth. James lifted the younger one into his arms, while Elizabeth reached for the elder, drawing her close. Dilara smiled faintly and extended a hand toward the older girl. "Scarlett, come here, sweetheart." The girl approached shyly, pressing herself against Dilara's leg. "Do you know who this is, darling?" she asked in her gentle, maternal tone. The child shook her head. "This is your Aunt Anya, your Uncle Fred, and your cousin Kai."
Anya looked at the child, and her heart faltered under the weight of recognition. Scarlett, James and Elizabeth's daughter, the child for whom she had once chosen to leave, to sever every forbidden thread that could have tied her to a love she was never meant to keep. She was beautiful, like a storybook princess, in white tights and a caramel-colored dress with a large ribbon, her curls tamed with clips, her eyes full of wonder. There was something in her that hurt and healed at the same time. Dilara gently placed Kai before Scarlett, and the two girls, nearly the same height, stood facing each other, studying one another in quiet fascination. Two cousins, two small sparks born of different worlds, meeting for the first time under the same roof. "Would you like to show Kai your room and your toys?" the grandmother asked, her voice warm and soft. Scarlett nodded shyly, her eyes lighting with curiosity, and she looked toward her new cousin. Dilara then brushed her fingers over Kai's forehead and asked, "And you, Kai, would you like to play with your cousin?" But no answer came, because Kai couldn't hear the question. She stood still, wrapped in her quiet world. Anya gently touched her shoulder, and with her hand shaped the words, signing the invitation. With a wide, bright smile, Kai nodded eagerly, took Scarlett's hand, and together they disappeared up the grand staircase, two little figures ascending into the unknown, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo even louder. But that silence wasn't empty. It pressed against Anya's chest, heavy and unrelenting. She cracked her knuckles nervously, then finally spoke, her voice trembling with emotions she could no longer suppress. "As you've probably noticed," she began, her eyes moving across the room, though her words were meant for only one person. "My daughter is deaf. She cannot hear at all, but she's learning to read lips and to write. So I'd ask you to be mindful of what you say around her, and not put any extra burden upon her. She already carries one far too heavy for her age." A sharp silence fell over the room, the kind that stings and tightens the throat. Dilara sighed heavily, but before she could speak, Elizabeth's cold voice cut through the air. "I'm not surprised," she said. "After everything you've done in your life, it seems that life finally paid you back in a way." Dilara called her name, sharp, almost desperate, but Anya raised a hand, stopping her. "No," she said quietly, though her voice trembled with pain. "She's right, completely right, and it's clear we're not welcome here. We'll be leaving soon. I won't allow it," her mother cut in firmly, her voice filled with a kind of merciless love. "You'll stay here, all three of you." Elizabeth tried to object, suggesting a hotel instead coldly, almost rudely, but Dilara silenced her before she could continue. "There was no room left for discussion. Their room is already prepared. They'll stay here, and that's final." Anya attempted to protest, softly, almost wearily. She said they hadn't planned to stay long, that they didn't want to take up space. But Dilara interrupted her with a question that rang out like an old reminder, tender yet unyielding. "Is that even possible, Anya? This is your home, too." Elizabeth rolled her eyes in quiet defeat, while their mother, calm but resolute, added, "You can stay as long as you wish." Anya then turned to Fred, to the hand that still held hers, and whispered, "Shall we stay tonight and leave tomorrow morning, after breakfast?" He nodded softly, his voice low and reassuring. "That sounds perfectly fine to me. We'll have enough time to get back to London and get the kids ready for school." His calm, quiet strength was all she needed in that moment. "You don't mind?" she asked, fighting the weight of old memories that crept up from within. "I don't mind, love," he answered. Those words, simple and honest, struck James like a thunderclap. Without a word, he handed the little girl over to Elizabeth and walked out of the room, leaving behind a silence thicker than smoke. After a pause, Dilara spoke again, her tone measured but carrying an undertone of significance. "Our lawyer is coming this afternoon. He wants to speak with all of us. I'd like you to be there, Anya." Anya hesitated, asking quietly if she was sure. She didn't want to interrupt something already arranged, but her mother reassured her. "You should listen," she said gently. "What is this about, Mama?" Anya asked. "Honestly, I don't know." "Oh, Anya, you have no idea how happy I am that you're here." And then there was no room left for words. Dilara pulled her into her arms, holding her as if she could somehow make up for all the lost years, all the unspoken sentences, and all the moments that had slipped away. In that embrace, sorrow blended with tenderness, pain with peace, and Anya closed her eyes, sinking into the familiar scent of her mother's perfume, the same one that, once upon a time, had meant safety in another life entirely. Silence reigned once more, this time in the vast office of the family estate, and it seemed as though even the walls absorbed the tension, refusing to let a single sound drift too far. Dilara sat behind a massive walnut desk, struggling to align a large white folder at a perfect angle, but every attempt ended in failure, as if her gaze kept slipping and her hands no longer obeyed her will. Behind her, the wall had disappeared beneath rows upon rows of bookshelves, their contents arranged by color in almost obsessive precision. Fred stood quietly, letting his presence blend into the room, entranced by the sight before him. Many of those books appeared to be rare editions, collector's volumes from the previous century, their gold-embossed covers whispering of a time when words carried the weight of eternity and reading was an act of reverence. His hand found Anya's shoulder, and she accepted his touch with fingers cold and fragile, burdened with unspoken emotion, as though they were holding together the scattered pieces of her heart. In the far corner, by a tall window veiled in half-drawn curtains through which pale daylight filtered, stood James and Elizabeth, both cloaked in stiff silence, acutely aware that the heaviness in the room had everything to do with their presence. Elizabeth's face was restless, carved with fine shadows of impatience, her expression betraying a discomfort she no longer tried to hide. Her eyes, dark, narrow, and sharp, kept darting toward the door, as if every second of waiting was an affront to her composure. "Where is he? He's late," she muttered through clenched teeth, her tone trembling with both anger and unspoken dread. Dilara glanced at the watch on her wrist and then spoke softly, as if to soothe both her daughter and herself. "A little patience, Elizabeth. There's still time." But Elizabeth recoiled instantly, her irritation flaring like a spark that refused to die. "Patience? This is a waste of time, Mother." Her stiffness carried a challenge that hung heavy in the air. Dilara drew a deep breath, and her next words resonated through the room, like both a plea and a warning. "Could you please stop being so bitter?" "Bitter?" Elizabeth repeated with a mocking lift of her brow, as a gesture that wounded more than it provoked. "Yes, this isn't only about you. It concerns all of us, and your attitude is making everything harder than it already is. Please, enough." Weary from her own helplessness, Dilara exhaled deeply, watching as her daughter rolled her eyes and turned away toward the window, refusing to yield. Her defiance was palpable in every movement, in the way her arms were crossed tightly over her chest. James, standing beside her, looked powerless, defeated even, aware that he no longer possessed the strength to soften her stubbornness. The door latch clicked softly, opening with cautious restraint, and a man in his middle years stepped inside. Dressed in a black suit, marked by the quiet authority of his profession, he carried a sleek leather briefcase in one hand. His presence shifted the air, and every breath in the room seemed to thicken. "Good afternoon," he said calmly, closing the door behind him before walking toward Dilara's desk with steady, deliberate steps. Dilara immediately rose to greet him, and Anya, nervous yet polite, stood as well, extending her hand in an attempt to mask her unease behind a faint, flickering smile. "Anya Woodbridge, if I'm not mistaken?" he asked, his tone gentle. "Yes, sir, that's me," she replied quietly, and added inwardly, with a bitter twist, "the black sheep of the family." "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," he said before turning his gaze toward the man whose protective presence could be felt even in silence. He extended his hand, which Fred accepted with a brief nod. "Killian Yakowski." "Attorney. Frederick Stevenson," Fred replied evenly. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Mr. Stevenson, Miss Woodbridge." Yakowski then looked toward Elizabeth and James, who acknowledged him with the faintest nods, before taking a seat across from Anya. Setting the briefcase in his lap, he unfastened it with practiced precision. "There's something we need to discuss," he began, his voice steady but weighted. He drew out a thick stack of papers and closed the case with deliberate care. "And it's a matter that requires everyone's attention." Following the old customs of hospitality, Dilara asked if he would like something to drink, but he declined with a courteous smile before returning to the documents. "So," he continued, lifting the paper slightly, "this is what we must address. I've had these documents in my possession for 3 years now. As you're probably aware, Mr. Ryan Woodbridge transferred most of his ownership and managerial rights of the company to his daughter, Mrs. Elizabeth Livingston." His gaze lingered briefly on Elizabeth, who gave a small, composed nod, her face betraying no surprise. Anya knew nothing of this, but she managed to maintain a calm expression, nodding faintly, as though confirming what was, in truth, utterly foreign to her. One of the properties under his name, including this very house, and a considerable share of the company's stock, remained under his sole control. For years, he managed Woodbridge Inc. personally and allowed no one to interfere in its affairs, something Mrs. Woodbridge here can attest to. Dilara nodded quietly, but Elizabeth interrupted her with a sharp impatience that betrayed how close she was to losing control. "That's irrelevant now. Please, go on." The attorney cleared his throat softly, his tone deepening, while his fingers tightened around the edges of the papers he held. "This testament was handed to me personally by Mr. Woodbridge. His handwritten words and signature carry a weight that no one can dispute. In these documents, he revokes the restriction he had previously imposed." His gaze then shifted to Anya, as though every word that followed belonged solely to her.
Which means that everything under his ownership now passes to you, Miss Anya Woodburg. This is the portion of the inheritance he preserved specifically for you, and to which he granted full rights of disposition. The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Elizabeth gasped, her breath vanishing as the world before her blurred, and the ground beneath her seemed to give way. Could it be possible that her father, the same man who had been unyielding toward Anya, had, in the end, chosen to leave her half of the fortune? Could he have forgiven her in silence, without a word, and made this decision as his final act of will? Bitterness, betrayal, and pain all surged within her at once, merging into something raw and consuming. The attorney continued, his voice unwavering. For 3 years now, Miss Woodburg, you have been the co-owner of half of Woodburg, Inc. Your father wished to retain control of the company until his death, but in his testament, he stated clearly that the company should be divided equally between the two of you, Elizabeth and Anya. Anya's heart pounded so fiercely it felt as if it would shatter her ribs. She couldn't tell whether she felt relief, shock, or a burden too heavy to bear. Her hands trembled, yet she managed to whisper, almost mechanically, "Thank you, Mr. Yakowski." Her body longed to flee the room, to find air, to hide from everything that had suddenly awakened within her, but Elizabeth's voice sliced through the air like a blade. "No, sit down," she ordered, stepping closer to the attorney and leaning over him. "She can refuse this mistake my father made, can't she?" "Elizabeth!" Delara's rebuke came sharp and weary, the sound of a mother exhausted from fighting her own child. But Elizabeth remained relentless, turning on the attorney with fiery determination. "I'm serious. James and I can buy her share and become the sole owners. That's possible, isn't it?" Yakowski shifted uneasily, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. "If Miss Woodburg decides to sell her share, yes, it would be possible. I'd be more than happy to help her get out of all this," Elizabeth said, her voice coated with a false sweetness that couldn't disguise the venom beneath. "If she agrees, we can begin the process immediately. What do you say, sister?" The word sister dripped from her mouth with bitter falseness, an obligation spoken through clenched teeth rather than a gesture of kinship. The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp, as the attorney hesitated before speaking again, his tone cautious. "If Miss Woodburg grants permission to initiate the process, of course, I could begin at once." Anya couldn't grasp what was unfolding, her thoughts scattered in all directions, her emotions spilling over and blending until she could no longer distinguish where pain ended and confusion began. It felt as though she were standing in the eye of a storm, unable to find her way out. Her legs carried her forward on their own, breathless, as she rushed out of the office whose walls suddenly felt too narrow to contain everything that had just happened. Fred immediately followed, calling her name, his voice low but filled with a quiet persistence stronger than panic. Behind them, Delara rose abruptly, anger trembling through her hands as she slammed her palms against the desk. Her gaze cut through the air like a blade, fixed on the daughter who now seemed a stranger, consumed by arrogance and bitterness that no longer belonged to the child she had raised. "We will discuss your behavior, Elizabeth. Leave her be. Do you hear me? Leave her alone." Her words echoed through the room before she, too, left, following Anya, leaving behind a suffocating air and people trapped in the weight of their own thoughts. James and Elizabeth remained alone with Mr. Yakowski, whose weary hands now pressed against his temples, as if he could ease the relentless pressure building within. Out in the hallway, Anya moved unsteadily, as though she might collapse beneath the weight of it all. Fred caught up to her, gently taking her hand and pulling her close, wrapping her in his arms, as if he could shield her from everything that hurt and frightened her. Her eyes were closed, her breathing uneven and trembling, as she sank into the safety of his embrace, finding in it a fragile anchor that reminded her she was not entirely alone. "I've got you," he whispered into her hair, and within that quiet promise lay a vow that needed no words, one felt deep within the bones. His gaze lifted then, meeting Delara's as she approached. In her eyes, heavy and tired, lay sorrow and regret, the kind of pain that gathers over years, searching for a way out. She placed a gentle hand on Anya's back, as though each touch might both mend and protect. "I am deeply sorry for Elizabeth's behavior," she said softly, but firmly, with the resolve of a woman who knew she no longer had the right to make excuses. "I'll speak to her, I promise. But Anya, if my opinion means anything at all, I hope you won't sell your share of the inheritance to your sister. I believe Ryan had a reason for leaving that half to you. I believe he wouldn't want you to lose it.
As she spoke, her fingers slipped tenderly through Anya's hair, in the same way she used to comfort her when she was just a child. Anya slowly turned her head toward her mother, struggling to keep her composure, though the glassy sheen in her eyes betrayed her. Despite her efforts to remain calm, the strength she had guarded so carefully deserted her, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. She leaned into Dolores' arms, a firm, almost desperate embrace, as though both women knew they had to hold on to each other in that fleeting moment, because tomorrow might not grant them the same chance. Meanwhile, Elizabeth escorted Mr. Yakowski out through the back door, toward the car parked in the courtyard. Her voice was steady, filled with a confidence that barely concealed the restlessness burning beneath. "I believe Anya was taken aback by my suggestion," she said coolly, "but I'm certain that when she's had time to think, she'll agree. If she decides to proceed, we can easily begin the process," the lawyer replied, reaching into his briefcase and drawing out a new folder. "These are the documents concerning the second company. You'll need to review and sign them before entering into partnership with the new investors." After a brief pause, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Ah, nearly forgot this. What is it?" Elizabeth asked, her eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Mr. Woodberg wrote a letter to Anya. I'm supposed to deliver it to her." "A letter for Anya?" she repeated slowly, raising an eyebrow. "All right, I can give it to her." The attorney hesitated, as if debating with himself, then asked with quiet uncertainty, "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said curtly, extending her hand toward him. Yakowski exhaled, watching her with a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but at last he placed the envelope into her palm. "Thank you," she murmured, examining the handwriting across the envelope, and in that instant, her face froze. She would have recognized that handwriting among 1,000 others. It was her father's. "Please, make sure she receives it," he added. "I will," she answered with a smile that barely managed to conceal the bitterness beneath. "I must be on my way now. I'm glad we've settled everything. Until next time, Mrs. Livingston. Until next time, Mr. Yakowski." She watched as the lawyer got into his car and drove away, but there wasn't a trace of satisfaction in her chest. Instead, she felt a burning fury, cold, sharp, and twisting inside her like a blade forged from betrayal. She was angry at her father, at her sister, at the cruel order of life that had pushed her into the role of the bystander, while the most precious things were handed to the one she despised. He had left everything to Anya, to the sister she hadn't truly considered her blood, but rather an adversary and someone who had always stood in her way. Her steps quickened as she made her way back into the house, her gaze darting over the walls as if searching for invisible witnesses. Swiftly, she hid the envelope inside the folder and withdrew to the office, locking the door behind her. Only then did she allow herself to stop. She sat at the desk, clutching the envelope, staring at it as if it was some relic from another world, dangerous and forbidden, and felt her curiosity swell, wild and unstoppable. Even with the walls guarding her secret, she didn't feel safe. Distrust whispered that someone might be listening just beyond the door. At last, her hand trembled. She reached for the letter opener and with one quick motion, sliced along the edge of the envelope. Her fingers shook as she drew out the paper, careful not to tear it. As her eyes began to trace the first lines, she felt each sentence cut deeper into her, each word pressing itself into her like an old wound reopening. These weren't words meant for her, and yet they carried a weight she could not escape. "Anya, my dear daughter." Her father's words were soft and frail, burdened with remorse, with a desperate longing for forgiveness that he would never hear. He confessed his mistakes, pleaded for understanding, spoke of the company he was leaving her as a final gesture of trust, an atonement he had failed to find in life. But Elizabeth could not bear it. The fury, the bitterness, the betrayal, all of it surged within her, stronger than reason. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she crushed the paper in her fist, then tore it apart piece by piece, throwing the fragments into the wastebasket beside the desk. There was no space in her mind for Anya to receive this letter, no room for her sister to ever learn that their father had forgiven her, or that he had left her the comfort that might free her from guilt. As the shreds of paper sank among the rubbish, she wiped her angry tears away, drew a deep breath, and straightened up, forcing the mask of calm control back onto her face. When she finally left the office, she appeared composed, but inside her, a storm raged, a sea of fury and grief that sooner or later would rise and consume her whole.
Children. More than one child. The very thought struck James like a sudden bolt of lightning in the stillness of night, sharp, merciless. And as his thoughts swirled in chaos, an overwhelming urge rose within him to run, to find shelter from the weight of his own emotions that were dragging him to his knees. He stepped outside, drawing in the cold air that was supposed to ease the tightness in his chest. But it didn't help. Everything was too close, too heavy, too painful. He needed to get away from Fred, from Anya,
from their daughter and from the image of a family he would never belong to. He swore to himself that he would disappear from their world, even if it meant forcing himself to vanish, because only distance could keep him from breaking completely. He walked along the forest path that led toward the old barns, his feet moving forward on their own without plan and without purpose, as though instinct was leading him to a place where silence could swallow him whole. He tried to erase every trace of Anya, Elizabeth, even his own thoughts, but it was useless. Everything returned, again and again, cutting deeper each time. He needed a distraction, any distraction, and as if the universe had heard him, a voice called from behind. "Hey man, wait up!" came the familiar, careless tone of Maximilian, his constant shadow, the source of trivial chatter and foolish jokes that, despite everything, somehow managed to make James smile when the world was falling apart. He slowed down, letting him catch up, though he knew he had no strength for company. Max appeared with that same irrepressible grin that always pushed the darkness aside and asked cheerfully what was new, as if everything around them were just another ordinary day. But James stayed silent, trapped in his own world. "I just wanted to catch you," Max went on. "You've been nowhere to be found lately, like you've turned into a ghost." He even tried to joke, but it wasn't enough to draw a word out of James. Still, persistence has a way of cracking silence. "What's going on with you, man? Don't tell me you've grown tired of Maximilian's attention," he teased, winking. And for a fleeting moment, a faint, uncertain smile broke through the darkness of James's thoughts. Thin, fragile, but real. Max, for all his loudness, knew how to lighten the weight. It was brief, but precious, because after everything, it felt good to feel something again. Anything other than the cold emptiness inside. "Sorry, mate. I just haven't been feeling right these last few hours," James admitted, deliberately avoiding the depth of truth, because what had ignited in him that morning wasn't an illness. It was a storm threatening to destroy everything in its path. Max nodded slightly, as if he knew more than he let on. "Yeah, I noticed," he said, and in that simple sentence lay the quiet gravity of friendship. James sighed, realizing how transparent he had become in trying to hide his weakness. "Too much going on in my head," he added, a half-truth, crafted to disguise the real torment. Max, concerned, tried to reach him, suggested rest, warned him not to neglect himself, spoke of exhaustion and colds, as if everything could be reduced to physical fatigue. But James knew nothing could be worse than what he already carried inside. He tried to smile, but it was a thin, artificial curve of the lips, as a poorly glued mask. Max didn't expose him, or maybe he did, but wisely chose silence instead. That silence, that space without questions, was rare and merciful. "How about a beer tonight?" Max suggested brightly, as though simple company and alcohol could fix everything, as though friendship and a drink could drown demons. James paused, imagining himself drinking, then walking to her, ignoring Fred, ignoring reason. The image was so vivid, it made his chest tighten. Alcohol wasn't the cure. It would only be the spark. It would drag him to her doorstep and force him to confess what was eating him alive, that he had never stopped loving her. The thought was poisonous, so he shook his head gently and declined, careful not to offend his friend. Max kept watching him, then suddenly asked the question that had clearly been on his mind, whether it was drugs. That made James let out a brief, bitter laugh, insincere, but freeing. "I wish it were that simple," he said. "You can recover from drugs. This has no cure." It was one of those rare moments of truth, though still wrapped in enough vagueness to conceal its heart. Max recognized the heaviness in his tone. He tried to make him open up again, but James lied once more, said he was fine, that everything was all right, that he'd get through it. It was an empty phrase, spoken with practiced ease, yet without a shred of conviction. He couldn't tell him the truth. How could he? How could he say that he felt something forbidden, that he was bound to a woman he should never have even looked at that way, let alone loved? How could he explain that his soul had been suffocating for years in longing for his wife's sister? No one would understand, not even Max, perhaps especially not Max. He needed to get away, to find any kind of refuge. The image of the little girl still burned in his mind, their daughter, looking at him from her mother's arms, while her father stood behind them, like an unshakable pillar. Fred, solid, grounded and unwavering. Anya, peaceful and safe in that protection. Their child, sheltered within the certainty of their embrace. The image of a family that wasn't his. It was a sight worse than punishment, a quiet torment that forced him to watch what was once his, now lost forever. And as he stood there, uncertain even of his own steps, he felt his soul tearing apart. He turned away, determined to escape, to go as far as possible, to be alone with thoughts that cut like glass. He knew he would sit in his car, wait, hope they'd leave, though deep down, he doubted he could ever truly flee from that image. Every time he looked at her, he knew she was ready for their paths to cross again, even in front of Elizabeth, and that destroyed him. Her happiness was proof that she had long erased him, that she had found her peace, and he was still trapped, too blind to realize he hadn't even reached the bottom yet. He didn't know how to let her go. He didn't know how to endure the silence she had left behind. In search of something, anything, to keep him afloat, he had unconsciously reached for Elizabeth. But she wasn't salvation. She was only a shadow, a pretense, the last straw he clung to out of despair. The darkness spreading through him could no longer be stopped, and he knew that as long as Anya breathed in another man's arms, he would never know peace.